بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Assalamu alaikum. My name is Alia Salem, and I'm the founder and executive director of FACE, which stands for Facing Abuse in Community Environments. Joining me in facilitating this presentation today is Sara Bawany, FACE's full-time social worker who is an LMSW and certified case manager. FACE investigates allegations of abuse at the hands of religious and community leaders and exposes the substantiated allegations in the hopes that we can help victims on their path towards healing and protect people from becoming future victims. We also provide education and awareness campaigns, as well as helping communities make better hiring and firing decisions for those who occupy the highest positions of trust and authority. So a big part of this problem is that many faith communities, like ours, operate within a decentralized structure without oversight that exists to hold abusers accountable or process and procedures. Most congregations will indeed fire an abusive leader, but they often do so quietly, paving the way for abusers to move on to another community and continue perpetuating harm. So to make matters worse, as members of marginalized and minority communities, we're seeing the weaponization of negative information against Muslims has created such a climate of fear that many victims refuse to come forward out of a concern for drawing more negative attention upon an already besieged community. Today, we're going to review a little bit about FACE's background and framework, as well as anecdotal information based on our own findings, and this should not be considered evidence-based. So we were founded because of the gap in ethical processes within the Muslim community for holding abusers accountable when they violate their positions of authority. The principles behind our model include things like survivors' voices are overwhelmingly underrepresented and deserve to be uplifted. Legal systems and law enforcement often fail to deliver justice or restoration to survivors and often do not hold perpetrators accountable. Communities have the right to know when their leaders are abusing their authority and should be empowered to hold them accountable. And FACE's work corroborates and substantiates allegations of abuse, which helps to embolden communities to speak out and act on credible allegations. And finally, community organizing and public pressure are powerful tools to interrupt abuse and the silence that surrounds it. We are a proud Muslim women-led and survivor-led team of diverse Muslim women and men that bring our expertise to the table in combating this incredibly difficult issue. Our team is made up of professionals in the fields of law, grassroots organizing, mental health, organizational development, ethics and compliance, finance, and Islamic methodology. Now I'm going to turn it over to Sara to delve into some stats and demographics that we've collected and found relevant to share with you all today. Sara, take it away.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. I'm going to be discussing some of the numbers that we've collected from the last 3 years since our inception. Since we were founded in May 2017, we've received 74 reports of abuse with 22 open cases and about 7 pending in intake. As you can see, the number of reports we've received has grown each year and is set to top last year's number of 30 new reports. The maps on the presentation show the frequency of the number of cases we've received in each state and province. Of course, Texas doesn't just happen to have the highest number of cases overall, but since FACE is based here, we have a broader reach and receive many of the cases from our local communities. It's also important to note that our reach is beginning to extend beyond the Sunni community, and we have received reports outside the Muslim community as well. The majority of the cases we receive are primarily sexual and spiritual abuse, but we have also begun to uncover an egregious child abuse by teachers in Islamic parochial and Sunday schools. With this information, we are working to launch an education and awareness campaign to help institutions make better hiring and firing decisions, as well as educating parents on the existence and manifestations of these issues within Islamic schools. So there's a lot of misunderstanding and misconception around FACE's scope of practice and the methodology by which we operate. So in order to ensure transparency, as well as work to constantly improve our process, we have created a flowchart which broadly summarizes the case process from the moment we receive an allegation to when we publish a full misconduct report. Of course, the process must always begin with a formal allegation, which is submitted through a form on our website under Report Abuse, where we ask for contact information of the alleging party, as well as some basic overview details of the situation. Once this allegation is received, we put it through two filters. One, does it fall within our scope? Meaning, is it a religious or community leader who is specifically using their position of power to physically, spiritually, financially, or sexually abuse someone? And two, is this person a primary victim of the abuse or a primary source of the abuse? Without someone who has firsthand knowledge of the situation, it is impossible for us to proceed. Once we can answer yes to both of those questions, we conduct an intake with predetermined questions which usually lasts up to an hour. The questions probe on the existence of evidence and witnesses willing to speak with us, as well as what has already been done to mitigate the situation at the legal and community level. During the intake, we do not go into detail about the abuse. This is to prevent the victim or source from experiencing continuous re-traumatization, as we provide them an opportunity during the investigation to share their full experience with us. Our primary purpose is to determine whether or not this case falls within our bucket, whether there is initial evidence available to substantiate, and whether FACE has the ability to proceed. After the intake, if we determine that there is sufficient information, we send the alleging party an informed consent document. This is one of the most important parts of our process and was created for a few reasons. While some aspect of what we do is advocacy, we are not an advocacy organization as a whole and must maintain some level of objectivity in each of these cases. This process is also not a risk-free one, and we want to make sure the alleging party has full knowledge of the implications of a potential public report of our findings, despite FACE going to great lengths to protect the identities of everyone who speaks to us. Additionally, while we are victim-centered, we are not victim-directed, meaning that the victim or source has the ability to withdraw their participation once the case has been opened, but that does not ethically obligate FACE to halt the investigation immediately. Should extenuating circumstances arise, especially around the safety of the victims, we will always take those circumstances into account. Lastly, the informed consent process serves to be a deterrent in the rare case of false reporting. Once the alleging party has signed the informed consent, we begin the investigative process, which right now with a staff of 2 takes many, many months and sometimes years to complete in its entirety. This involves extensive data and evidence gathering, interviews with as many people with firsthand knowledge as possible, and pre-COVID, it also included multiple trips to the communities where the abuse transpired. Towards the conclusion of the investigation, we also make preparations to speak to the accused party as well. Once the allegations have been filtered by whether or not they have been substantiated, we compile them into a draft of the report, which then goes through an extensive, in-depth revision and editing process by our board, subject matter experts who serve as advisors, and our advisory board. Multiple drafts later, once it has been thoroughly vetted, the report, if to be made public, is released with a disclaimer to the community a few days prior. We then launch into our community support phase, which we are still building out. As we know, exposing the information and bringing it to light is a difficult and exhausting job that few are willing to do, but what is most important is empowering the community to take matters into their own hands and take the necessary action needed. We are working on a post-report release community toolkit as well as a detailed code of conduct for institutions to adopt and implement, which details how to handle these cases when they arise within the community.
In the 3 years since our inception, and with 74 allegations submitted and counting, we have noticed a trend in the reasoning behind victims and sources being hesitant to speak to us about their knowledge of an abusive leader. These fears and protective mechanisms are rooted in a desire to protect the Muslim community at large, especially in a time when society is so deeply polarized and the instances of Islamophobia are skyrocketing. There's also a misunderstanding amongst the Muslim community around the principle of sitr, which is an Arabic word meaning to cover the private sin of an individual. Many believe that to out an abuser would be considered backbiting, as opposed to it being an Islamic obligation to call out community injustices, which is rooted in our tradition. As you can see on the slide, the overwhelming concern for reputation is the main barrier standing in the way of effectively holding abusers accountable. For this reason, FACE's primary goal in the work that we do is to shift this cultural positioning to one that prioritizes victims and community harm above personal and institutional reputation. Keeping everything mentioned in mind, and in order to discuss the implications of mental health for victims of this kind of abuse, we wanted to highlight a snapshot of a case study from the very first misconduct report that we released. The study focuses on the report findings resulting from the allegations by Jane Doe 1 against Zia Sheikh in Irving, Texas, where he spiritually abused and sexually exploited her for his own personal benefit. We want to be careful not to appear to diagnose Jane Doe 1 because, after all, we're not her therapists, but we noticed in working with her that she exhibited some of the following. The environment in which Zia Sheikh created for Jane Doe 1 was ripe for exploitation, with Zia Sheikh grooming her since adolescence vis-a-vis a pastoral counseling relationship and close familial and protective relationship ties. An instance of father figure transference appeared to manifest from Jane Doe 1 upon Zia Sheikh to the point of her openly calling him Baba. Before the coercive sexual relationship began that Zia Sheikh manipulated Jane Doe 1 into, and especially after, she displayed symptoms of depression and anxiety, as well as symptoms of elevated rage, numbness, insomnia, and flashbacks, all of which are consistent with the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. She repeatedly sought out Zia Sheikh, even after the sexual encounter, attempting to reconcile with him, even after he had cut her off completely. During this time, Jane Doe 1 exhibited her most destructive and harmful behavior towards herself and others, lashing out constantly against people trying to help and support her through her ordeal, while also experiencing the traumatic reactions of her mother and stepfather, who at one point forced her out of the home. She began engaging in risky behaviors, such as the misuse of drugs and alcohol, and gained a significant amount of weight in a short period of time. She expressed suicidal ideations, both passive and active. She also removed her hijab. We mention all of this not as a judgment, but as a relevant piece of information that will become more important in the next slide. Frustrated with the conflicting feelings resulting from Zia Sheikh's exploitation and subsequent abandonment, Jane Doe 1 vocalized her anxiety and sense of helplessness with her situation, but also with the exhaustive process of a FACE investigation. With little process surrounding the participation framework for a victim within the nascent FACE investigative model, one that did not include the appropriate expectation setting, Jane Doe 1 withdrew her participation in the process around the middle of the investigation. Luckily, FACE had already procured an independent attorney and independent therapist for Jane Doe 1, who were able to use victim-directed models that allowed Jane Doe 1 to have a deeper sense of control over her situation. FACE withdrew from active participation in communications with Jane Doe 1 while maintaining an open line of communication through her attorney. After a few months at the discovery of more victims at the hands of Zia Sheikh's manipulation, Jane Doe 1 re-entered the investigative process with a renewed sense of determination and purpose.
We have seen many of our victims since Jane Doe 1 experience all of the above and more. To add insult to injury, survivors like Jane Doe 1 are often re-victimized by their religious communities when they are not believed or adequately supported, which may lead to further social detachment on their behalf. In the work we have done for the last 3 years and are continuing to do, we have become very familiar with the perfect victim fallacy. This is the idea that every victim handles their trauma similarly and will react the same, especially the fallacy that they would or should be grateful to those trying to assist them through their trauma. In the Islamic context, the perfect victim fallacy would place disproportionate emphasis not just on the victim's reaction, but also on their character and background as a whole, such as, for example, whether or not they wore the hijab, were practicing Muslims, engaged in risky or haram behavior, or were intimate outside of marriage with another person. It is these fallacies that, when internalized, prevent people from taking victims' allegations seriously, paying adequate attention to the needs of victims, and being mindful of their individual healing and grieving processes. It is with all of these considerations in mind that FACE aims to cultivate an environment that provides victims and alleging parties with adequate protections and expectations so that they may participate from an informed and supported position. This would allow them the necessary control to provide meaningful consent when they come forward to seek solutions, while also protecting the integrity and ethical framework of FACE's work. This is the conclusion of our formal presentation. We are so grateful for your time and attention to this important matter. This is our contact information below. You can also text the number below, and our email, info@facetogether.org, will go to the both of us. I also encourage you to visit our website, www.facetogether.org, and specifically check out the misconduct report sections. Jazakallah khair.
Jazakumullahu khairan to everyone for listening, and we look forward to your questions in the next segment of this presentation. Thank you so much. Assalamu alaikum.